Elena Parker had never intended to become the center of a dare. She had always been the quiet one, the responsible one, the girl who never missed a deadline and never crossed the line. Her friends at art school called her the good girl, the one who painted landscapes and flowers, and never once took a risk with her work or her life. But that night, the night everything changed, she heard herself laugh when one of them threw down the challenge. It was a small party in a tiny Brooklyn apartment, the air thick with cheap wine and louder than necessary music. Someone, probably Sam, had pulled up an article on his phone. Ethan Hale, the billionaire tech genius turned recluse, had rented a private studio at one of the most prestigious art spaces in Manhattan. Rumor had it he spent hours there, alone, sitting for portraits that no one ever saw. Who was painting him? No one knew. Why was he doing it? No one cared. But his presence alone, in a space reserved for elite artists, made everyone curious. That was when the bet started. "Come on, Elena, you are always sketching trees and sunsets. Don't you want to draw something real for once?" It was stupid, she knew it, but her heart was raw that night, bruised from a professor's sharp words about her art lacking risk and depth. So when Sam smirked and said, "I dare you to sneak in and sketch him," she said yes. Elena told herself it was harmless. She would walk in quietly, sit in the back of the room, and maybe capture a few lines in her notebook before slipping out unseen. She had no intention of bothering anyone. It was just a dare, just a moment of rebellion she could laugh about later. That was how she found herself in front of the heavy wooden door at nearly midnight, her sketchbook clutched to her chest, her heart pounding loud enough she was sure someone could hear it. She pushed the door open carefully. The room was vast, washed in soft golden light, with a massive canvas set up on one side. But what made her breath catch was the figure in the center. Ethan Hale sat on a stool, his back to her, entirely nude, his skin a pale contrast against the dark fabric draped around the room. His shoulders were broad, his hair slightly tousled, and even in stillness, he radiated something intense, something she could not quite name. Elena's hands trembled as she took out her pencil. She told herself to focus, just a few lines, a shape, capture the curve of his spine, the line of his shoulders. She barely breathed as she began sketching, her eyes flicking up and down between the paper and the man in front of her. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Then he moved. Elena's stomach dropped as he shifted, turning slightly, his head tilting as if listening. And then, before she could move, before she could even blink, he turned fully to face her. Their eyes met. Elena froze, pencil mid-stroke, her breath stuck in her throat. His face was sharp, striking, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, the world went silent, as if even the air was waiting. He did not cover himself. He did not look surprised. Instead, a slow, almost curious smile touched his lips. "I didn't think anyone had the courage to watch me when I'm not performing." Elena's cheeks burned as she stumbled backward, mumbling apologies, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. She had no idea what she had just walked into, no idea what she had just begun. But as she fumbled for the door, his voice stopped her one more time. "What's your name?" "Elena." She barely managed to whisper it. He nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. "Come back tomorrow, Elena." And somehow she knew she would. Elena lay in her tiny apartment that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, her heart still pounding, her face still hot from the encounter. She could hear her roommate's soft snoring in the next room and the distant hum of traffic outside, but none of it registered. All she could see was his face, those sharp eyes, the curve of his mouth when he spoke her name. She kept repeating his words over and over in her head. "Come back tomorrow, Elena." She did not know why he had asked her. She did not know what she was supposed to do or say or bring, but something in his voice, calm and sure, had hooked deep into her chest. By morning, she was exhausted but determined. She told no one where she was going. She left her sketchbook, tucked carefully into her bag, and took the long subway ride downtown, her mind racing the whole way. Who was Ethan Hale, really? She knew the headlines, of course. Everyone did. He was 32 years old, the founder of Hale Technologies, a company that had exploded in value after his revolutionary app took over half the world's devices. He had once been on the cover of every business magazine, photographed at every gala, praised as the genius of his generation. But in the last 2 years he had all but vanished. His company ran without him. His social calendar disappeared. There were no scandals, no stories, no affairs. Just silence. People speculated he was depressed or recovering from burnout, or maybe plotting his next big move. But no one really knew, because Ethan Hale had mastered the art of being untouchable. Elena, on the other hand, was as ordinary as they came. She had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a waitress and a mechanic. She had earned a partial scholarship to a New York art school, where she spent her days sketching in corners, working 2 part-time jobs, and trying not to fall behind on rent. Her art was safe, pretty, delicate. Her professors told her she needed to take risks, but Elena had never been a risk-taker. Until now. When she arrived at the studio, the assistant at the front desk waved her through without question. She hesitated in the hallway, her hands clammy, her knees weak. She wondered if she should turn back, pretend it had never happened, let the dare fade away like a half-remembered dream. But before she could decide, the door opened and Ethan Hale stood there, fully dressed this time, watching her with that same unreadable gaze. "You came," he said softly. "I wasn't sure you would." She swallowed hard. I wasn't sure either. He stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. Inside, the space was transformed. The easel and canvas were gone. The lights were dimmed. There was a table set with 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising gently from their rims. "Sit," he said. She obeyed without thinking. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She watched him carefully, trying to read his face, but it gave nothing away. Finally, he asked, "Why did you really come here?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. He gave a small smile. "It's all right. You don't have to answer. Most people come to me wanting something. Money, influence, recognition. But you? You came because you were dared, because you wanted to prove something, maybe not even to me, but to yourself. Am I right?" Elena bit her lip, unsure whether to nod or shake her head. "I don't know," she confessed, quietly. "I think I wanted to see if I could do it, if I could be brave just once." His eyes softened just a little. "And were you brave?" She forced a small smile. "I was terrified." His laugh was low, unexpected, almost warm. "Good. That means you're human." For the next hour they talked, not about art or business, but about everything else. Favorite books, childhood memories, the sound of rain on old rooftops. He asked questions, sharp and precise, that made her pause and think. She answered honestly, sometimes too honestly, and surprised herself by how much she wanted to tell him. By the time she left, the sun was setting, and she felt like the ground beneath her feet had shifted slightly, like the air had changed. She told herself it was a one-time thing, a strange, fleeting experience she would carry quietly and never speak of again. But the next day, when her phone buzzed with a short message, "Come back tonight," she did not hesitate. By the end of the week, it had become a rhythm. She would arrive at the studio in the evening, sketchbook in hand, though they rarely used it. They would sit and talk, sometimes in words, sometimes in long, companionable silences. He would pour coffee or tea, sometimes wine, and they would share stories or sit in thought. She learned that Ethan carried an invisible weight on his shoulders, one he never spoke about directly, but that pressed into every word he said, every pause between his sentences. She learned that his laugh was rare, but real, that his hands were steady when he poured a drink, but shook ever so slightly when he reached for her sketchbook, that his eyes watched her like she was something he could not quite figure out. And Ethan, he learned that Elena was not as innocent as she seemed, that beneath her quiet surface was a fierce, restless mind, that she had dreams she was afraid to say aloud, that she craved to be seen not as delicate or safe, but as someone who mattered. Neither of them said what was building between them. Neither of them named it, or reached for it, or claimed it, but it sat between them every night, growing stronger, waiting. The days stretched into weeks, and what had begun as a reckless dare slowly turned into a nightly ritual Elena could not explain to anyone, least of all herself. She found herself glancing at the clock every afternoon, counting the hours until she would once again stand in the quiet elevator that took her up to the private studio where Ethan waited. She never told her friends, never mentioned it at school, never even wrote about it in her journal. It was as if some fragile thread of understanding had formed between her and Ethan, and saying it aloud would shatter it. Each evening they met, there was no pattern, no set conversation, no agenda. Sometimes he asked her to bring her sketches, and they would sit together going over her drawings, his questions sharp and observant, challenging her in ways no one else dared. Other times they would sit in silence, sipping coffee or tea, as the city lights flickered outside the tall windows, saying nothing but somehow speaking volumes. Slowly, carefully, they began to reveal things they had never told anyone else. Elena spoke of her family, her mother's endless sacrifices, the nights she spent worrying about money, the constant pressure to succeed in a world that never seemed to notice her. Ethan spoke less, but when he did, his words carried a weight that made her heart ache. He told her about his early days, the long nights building his company, the betrayal of trusted friends, the moment he realized that success had isolated him rather than fulfilled him. He never spoke of his personal life, never mentioned family or past lovers. But in the quiet between them, Elena sensed a loneliness so deep it frightened her. Their moments together became charged with a tension neither of them named. There were no touches, no lingering glances, but everything they said, everything they shared, hummed with an unspoken electricity. Elena found herself watching his hands as he turned the pages of her sketchbook, the slight tremble of his fingers when their shoulders brushed by accident, the way his eyes softened when she made him laugh. She knew she was falling into something dangerous, something she could not control, but she could not bring herself to walk away. Then, one night, something shifted. She arrived late, flustered and breathless, her face still pink from running across town. Ethan was already there, standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his silhouette framed by the city skyline. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable, his eyes shadowed. "You are late," he said quietly. "I know, I am sorry," she began, but he raised a hand, silencing her. "Sit," he said softly. For the first time, the air between them felt heavy, strained. She perched on the edge of the couch, unsure of what had changed, unsure of how to bridge the sudden distance. Ethan stood for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the glass in his hand, then slowly crossed the room to sit across from her. "Do you know what they say about me, Elena?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, her throat tight. "They say I am cold, ruthless, incapable of feeling anything real. They say I built an empire because I was too broken to be part of the world around me. Do you believe that?" She met his eyes, her heart pounding. "No," she whispered. "I think you are lonely." For a heartbeat, something flickered in his expression, something raw and unguarded. Then he smiled, a small, sad curve of his lips. Maybe you are right." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. Do you know why I keep asking you to come back? She swallowed hard, shaking her head. Because when you are here, I remember what it feels like to want something just because it is beautiful, not because it can be bought or built or controlled. Elena's breath caught. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered near his. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time she saw him truly vulnerable, truly exposed, not in his body, but in his heart. That night they crossed an invisible line. They did not kiss, they did not touch. But when she left, he walked her to the door, his hand brushing hers for just a second longer than necessary. She went home that night, unable to sleep, her mind spinning with everything unsaid, everything felt, everything possible. She knew they were on the edge of something neither of them was ready to name, but both were too deep to deny. The next day she arrived at the studio to find the lights dimmed, the room filled with soft music she did not recognize. Ethan stood by the window, his back to her, his posture tense. When he turned, his eyes were darker than she had ever seen, his face shadowed with something close to pain. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. She stepped closer, her heart in her throat. "I was not supposed to let you in," he continued. "I told myself I would never let anyone this close again. But here you are, and I do not know how to stop wanting you here." Elena's eyes stung with sudden tears. "I never wanted anything from you," she whispered. "I never asked you for anything." "I know," he said softly. "That is why you are the only thing I trust." For a long moment they stood there, the air between them thick with everything they had kept hidden. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek, light as a breath. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, her heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. "I am afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he admitted, "but maybe for once we can be afraid together." That night, they sat side by side on the couch, their shoulders touching, their hands entwined, not speaking, not needing to. Outside, the city pulsed and roared, but inside, in the quiet of the studio, they found something neither of them had known they were looking for. Peace. It was not simple, it was not perfect, but it was real. And for Ethan Hale, for Elena Parker, real was more than enough. Elena had never been held like this before, not in a way that was desperate or hungry, but in a way that was steady and grounding. Ethan sat beside her on the couch, his arm draped across her shoulders, his hand resting lightly at the curve of her neck. Neither of them spoke much, and that in itself was the most surprising part. She had always imagined intimacy as something loud, fiery, consuming. But here, wrapped in the hush of a quiet studio with city lights dancing beyond the tall windows, she realized that the deepest connections were the ones that let you breathe. Ethan, for all his sharp edges and commanding presence, was softer when she was near. She saw it in the way his eyes softened when they met hers, in the way his fingers traced absent patterns against her shoulder, in the way his entire body leaned slightly toward her, like he was magnetized, without even realizing it. That night, after sitting together for what felt like hours, Ethan finally broke the silence. "I never told you why I started sitting for portraits," he murmured, his voice rough at the edges. She looked up at him, waiting. "It wasn't for vanity or publicity," he continued, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the window. "I did it because I needed to remember what it felt like to be seen." Elena's heart clenched. "I see you," she whispered before she could stop herself. His gaze flicked down to her then, sharp, clear, searching. "I know," he said quietly. "That's the part I don't know what to do with." In the days that followed, something between them shifted further. He stopped pretending she was just a visitor, a distraction, a passing curiosity. He began inviting her into his routines, small moments of his guarded world. She learned how he took his coffee, how he paced when he was thinking, how he watched old black and white films when he couldn't sleep. She noticed the little scars on his knuckles, the faint crease between his brows when he was lost in thought, the way his voice dropped half a note when he said her name, and he, in turn, learned her. He noticed how she chewed on the edge of her pencil when sketching, how she closed her eyes when listening to music, how her fingers trembled ever so slightly when she was nervous but trying to hide it. He never pushed her to reveal more than she wanted, never demanded more of her time than she could give, but he was always there, steady, waiting, open. One evening, as they sat together in the golden haze of lamplight, Elena felt a surge of courage rise in her chest. "Do you ever wonder what people would think if they saw us like this?" she asked softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. Ethan gave a small smile. "I stopped worrying about what people think a long time ago," but she pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "And what about you? What do you think this is?" For a long moment he was silent. Then, quietly, deliberately, he reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "I think," he murmured, "that this is the first time in years I've wanted something I can't control." The confession sent a shiver through her. She set her mug down, her heart thundering in her chest. "Ethan," she began, but he shook his head gently. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered. "I just needed you to know." That night, when she left, he walked her to the door as always. But this time, when she turned to go, he caught her hand and held it for just a beat longer. "Be careful, Elena," he said softly, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "The world has a way of trying to ruin anything real." She smiled faintly, her chest tight. "I know," she whispered, "but maybe we don't let it." In the weeks that followed, their quiet connection deepened. They still didn't name it, didn't label it, but it became something undeniable. Elena found herself bringing pieces of her own world into his, sketches she'd been too shy to show anyone, stories from her childhood, little hopes and fears she'd never spoken aloud. And Ethan, in turn, let her see pieces of himself he'd kept locked away for years. He told her about the betrayal that had nearly broken him, the business deals that had made him question his own ethics, the nights he lay awake wondering if all his success had been worth the loneliness it cost. One night, after a long evening spent talking and laughing, Ethan paused and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Can I show you something?" he asked. She nodded, her throat dry. He led her to a small back room she'd never seen before, a private space lined with canvases, unfinished portraits, half-sketched designs. In the center of the room stood an easel draped in a cloth. Slowly, carefully, Ethan pulled the cloth away, revealing a painting. Elena gasped softly. It was a portrait of her, or rather, of the way he saw her. Not a perfect likeness, but an impression. The curve of her smile, the tilt of her head, the quiet strength in her eyes. "I started this the night you first walked in," he murmured. "I didn't know why. I just knew I needed to capture something about you before it slipped away." Elena felt her eyes sting with sudden tears. "Ethan," she whispered, but he shook his head. "No, listen, I'm not showing you this because I want you to praise it or critique it. I'm showing you this because you are the first person who made me want to create something for the sake of beauty, not utility. You reminded me why I used to love art, why I used to love—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Love," she finished quietly. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the canvas. "Ethan," she said softly, turning to face him, "I don't know where this is going. I don't know if I'm ready to call it anything yet, but I know that when I'm here, with you, I feel like I'm more myself than anywhere else." His eyes softened, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. "Then stay," he murmured. That's all I want. Just stay. That night, for the first time, she did. Not as a guest or a distraction, but as someone who had been invited in, someone who belonged. She stayed late into the night, curled up beside him on the couch, her head resting against his shoulder, their hands intertwined. They talked in whispers, laughed softly, shared stories and silences and quiet dreams. And when the city finally began to stir with the early light of dawn, they sat together at the window, watching the world awaken, knowing that something between them had shifted forever. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't marked by declarations or promises. But it was real, and for both of them, that was the most terrifying, exhilarating thing of all. The morning after Elena first stayed over, everything should have felt awkward, uncertain, maybe even wrong, but instead there was an unfamiliar peace. She woke to the sound of Ethan moving quietly through the kitchen, the scent of coffee filling the air. Wrapped in one of his oversized shirts, she padded barefoot into the room, her hair mussed, her cheeks still flushed from sleep. Ethan turned as she entered, his mouth twitching into the faintest smile. "You're up," he murmured, handing her a mug. She smiled shyly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I didn't mean to stay so late," she whispered. His gaze softened. "I didn't want you to leave," he said simply. That small confession lodged itself deep in her chest. They sat together at the counter, sipping coffee in the hush of the early morning, the city below them just beginning to stir. For a while they didn't speak, and that was the most surprising thing of all, how easy the silence between them had become. But Elena knew this fragile bubble couldn't last forever. The world outside was waiting, and with it came all the questions they had so carefully avoided. As the days passed, the lines between them blurred further. Ethan began including her in parts of his life she knew were usually off-limits: quiet dinners at his penthouse, late-night drives through the city, stolen hours in hidden corners of art galleries. She watched as the man she'd once only seen as a distant figure unfolded before her. Not just the billionaire, the mogul, the public face of Hale Enterprises, but the man who ran his fingers through his hair when he was frustrated, who drank his coffee black and too hot, who stayed up all night reading when he couldn't sleep. But the more they shared, the heavier the weight between them became. Ethan had walls, and Elena could feel them every time they brushed up against moments that mattered too much. He was gentle with her, attentive, careful, but he never said what she longed to hear. And Elena, for all her growing confidence, began to wonder if she was falling deeper into something that was always meant to have an end. The breaking point came on a night that should have been perfect. Ethan invited her to a private charity event, something he rarely attended himself, much less brought anyone to. Elena borrowed a simple dress from a friend, styled her hair as best she could, and spent half the afternoon worrying she wouldn't belong. But when Ethan saw her, standing nervously at the edge of the lobby, his eyes lit up in a way that made her heart ache. "You're beautiful," he murmured, offering his arm. She smiled, her cheeks flushed, and for a while everything felt almost normal. They navigated the glittering crowd together, Ethan's hand warm at the small of her back, his voice low as he introduced her to people whose names she would never remember. But beneath the polished smiles and polite conversation, Elena felt the weight of the gazes that followed them, the quiet whispers, the subtle shifts in tone. She didn't miss the way some people looked at her with faint amusement, or the way certain women glanced at her, then at Ethan, with a kind of knowing smirk. And Ethan, for all his calm composure, was quieter than usual, more reserved, his fingers tightening ever so slightly on her arm when they passed certain groups. It wasn't until later, when they stood together on the balcony overlooking the city, that she found the courage to speak. "Do you regret bringing me?" she asked softly, her voice barely carrying over the noise below. Ethan turned to her sharply, his eyes flashing. "No," he said firmly. "Never." She swallowed hard. Then, why do you look like you're waiting for this to fall apart? For a long moment he was silent. Then he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Because I don't know how to want something I can't protect, he murmured. Elena's chest tightened painfully. Ethan, she began, but he shook his head, his jaw clenched. You don't understand, he said quietly. Everyone I let close becomes a target. My success, my past. The people who want to see me fall, they would use you to hurt me without thinking twice. I can't. I won't let that happen. She stepped closer, her hands trembling. But you're not giving me the chance to choose, she whispered. You're deciding for both of us. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment, she saw all of it, the fear, the longing, the desperate need to pull her close, and the equally desperate need to push her away. And before she could stop herself, she reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek. I don't want perfect, Ethan, she said softly. I just want real. That night, something between them cracked open. They returned to his penthouse in silence, the air thick with tension, neither quite sure what would happen next. But when the door closed behind them, when they were finally alone in the quiet, Ethan stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he cupped her face. I can't promise you safety, he murmured. I can't promise you forever. But I can promise you this right here, right now, you're the only thing I want. Elena's breath caught. She reached up, her fingers curling into his shirt, and without another word, she kissed him. It wasn't frantic or rushed. It was slow, deep, the kind of kiss that spoke of all the things they hadn't dared say. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against him, and she felt the shudder that ran through his body as she pressed closer. They moved together slowly, carefully, as if afraid to break the moment, their hands exploring, their mouths seeking, their hearts racing in tandem. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. Stay, he whispered. Please. And for the first time, Elena realized just how much he meant it. That night, they crossed the line they had both danced around for weeks. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, their touches gentle, their kisses unhurried. Every moment was a question and an answer, a promise and a plea. Elena traced the scars on Ethan's chest with trembling fingers, kissed the hollow of his throat, felt his body shudder beneath her touch. Ethan, in turn, moved with a tenderness she had never known, his hands cradling her as if she were something precious, his mouth whispering her name like a prayer. When they finally came together, it wasn't perfect. It was messy and clumsy and achingly human, but it was real. And afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies still trembling, their hearts still racing, Elena realized something she had never dared believe before. This wasn't just about desire or distraction or loneliness. This was about two people who had found something they weren't sure they deserved, but couldn't bring themselves to let go. As Ethan traced lazy circles on her back, his breath warm against her temple, Elena whispered, I'm scared. His arms tightened around her. Me too, he murmured. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we're supposed to be scared. In the quiet that followed, Elena felt the weight of all the things they still hadn't said, all the questions still waiting between them. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the answers. Because in that moment, wrapped in Ethan's arms, she understood something she had never understood before. Love wasn't about guarantees or safety or promises of forever. It was about choosing each other again and again, even when it was hard, even when it was messy, even when it was terrifying. And as she drifted into sleep, her head resting against Ethan's chest, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act, a fragile dance between the life they had quietly begun to build together and the reality of the world that waited just outside the penthouse walls. Ethan still had his company to run, his meetings and contracts and endless responsibilities, but now he always made time for Elena, carving out stolen hours between boardrooms and conference calls just to sit with her, to watch her sketch, to listen to her talk about things no one else ever thought to ask. Elena, in turn, began to find herself shifting, growing, stepping into a version of herself she had once only dreamed of becoming. She started taking on more commissions, showing her work to galleries, daring to believe she might be more than the girl who took a bet and stumbled into a billionaire's world. But the weight of their differences, the sharp contrast between their worlds, never truly went away. It hovered at the edges of every conversation, every moment of intimacy, every plan they tried to make for a future neither was quite sure they could claim. The twist came not from the outside, not from the tabloids or the gossip blogs or the whispering elite, but from something far more personal, far more unexpected. It began with a phone call. Elena was alone in Ethan's apartment, working on a new series of sketches, when the call came through. She hesitated before answering, unfamiliar with the number, but something told her to pick up. The voice on the other end was calm, polished, and unmistakably authoritative. "Miss Hart?" "I presume," the woman said smoothly. "My name is Victoria Hale." Elena's blood ran cold. She knew the name, of course everyone did. Victoria Hale, Ethan's estranged sister, the co-founder of Hale Enterprises, the woman who had once been Ethan's closest ally until a very public falling out had left their relationship in ruins. Elena's voice trembled as she spoke. "How did you get this number?" Victoria gave a small, humorless laugh. "Please, Miss Hart, do you really think I don't know everything happening in my brother's life?" The conversation that followed was sharp, laced with veiled threats and cold truths. Victoria didn't insult her, didn't raise her voice, didn't even sound angry. She simply laid out the facts. Ethan's reputation was on the line, the company was facing pressure from investors, and Elena's presence in his life was a distraction they could no longer afford. "You seem like a lovely girl," Victoria said calmly, "but Ethan has always been a man who thrives in control, and you, my dear, are the very definition of chaos." By the time Elena hung up, her hands were shaking. She sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the city lights through blurred vision, her mind racing. She had known, of course, that there were risks. She had known there would be people who disapproved, people who would question her place in Ethan's world. But she hadn't expected it to come from inside his own family, from someone who knew exactly how to cut at the deepest, most vulnerable places. When Ethan returned home late that night, Elena tried to act normal, tried to smile, tried to brush away the lingering ache in her chest, but he saw through her immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked softly, cupping her face in his hands. She shook her head, her throat tight. "Nothing," she whispered. "I'm fine." But he didn't believe her. He sat with her on the couch, pulling her close, his voice low and careful. "Elena, please, talk to me." And so, haltingly, she told him about the call, about Victoria's words, about the doubts that had been planted deep in her heart. Ethan's jaw tightened as he listened, his eyes darkening with something sharp and protective. "She had no right," he muttered. "She had no right to come to you." But Elena only shook her head, tears spilling over her cheeks. "Maybe she's right," she whispered. "Maybe you were better before me. Maybe all I've done is complicate your life." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it was almost painful. "You are the best complication that has ever happened to me," he said fiercely. "Don't let anyone, not even my sister, make you believe otherwise." But Elena couldn't shake the gnawing fear in her chest. That night, as they lay tangled in the sheets, she watched him sleep, memorizing the lines of his face, the rise and fall of his chest, the way his hand always found hers, even in dreams. And she wondered if loving someone like Ethan Hale meant learning how to let go before you became the thing that broke them. The next morning, she was gone. She left a note, small and simple, tucked beneath his coffee cup. "I love you," it read, "but I need to remember who I am when I'm not with you. Please don't chase me." Ethan woke to the empty apartment, the silence pressing in on him like a weight he couldn't lift. For days, he tried to tell himself it was temporary, that she would come back, that this was just another storm they would weather together. But as the hours stretched into days and the days into weeks, a hollow ache settled deep in his chest. He stopped going to meetings, he stopped returning calls. He stared out at the city, the apartment that once felt alive, now nothing more than a shell. Elena, meanwhile, threw herself into her work. She rented a small studio in a quiet corner of the city, poured every ounce of her heartbreak into her art. Her sketches became sharper, rawer, filled with longing and loss and the kind of beauty that only came from loving someone deeply enough to walk away. She told herself she had done the right thing, that she was protecting both of them, that she was proving she could stand on her own. But every night, as she lay in her narrow bed, she felt the empty space beside her like a phantom limb, a constant, aching reminder of what she had left behind. The breakthrough came quietly, unexpectedly. It was a cold afternoon, the sky heavy with snow, when Elena stepped into a small gallery to drop off a new piece. She wasn't expecting anyone to notice her, to care. But as she handed over the canvas, the gallery owner paused, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You're the one, aren't you?" he murmured. "The one who paints him." Elena's heart stuttered painfully in her chest. "I don't know what you mean," she said quickly, but the man only smiled gently. "I've been in this business a long time," he said, "and I've seen a lot of artists chase a lot of muses. But your work? It's not chasing, it's remembering." That night, for the first time in weeks, Elena allowed herself to hope. She stood at her window, staring out at the falling snow, and realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Maybe loving someone didn't mean protecting them from every storm. Maybe it meant learning how to weather it together. And so, with her heart in her throat, she picked up the phone. Ethan was sitting alone in his office, the lights dimmed, his phone untouched on the desk when it finally rang. For a moment, he simply stared at the screen, his heart hammering so hard in his chest it drowned out every rational thought. When he saw Elena's name, something inside him cracked wide open. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough and low. "Elena," he murmured, not even a question, just her name, as if saying it could summon her back to him. On the other end, she was silent for a beat, then whispered, "I'm sorry. I thought I had to walk away to protect us, but all I've done is run from the one place I belong." He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. "Come on," he whispered. That was all it took. That night, as the snow fell softly around the city, Elena arrived at the penthouse, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. Ethan opened the door before she could even knock, pulling her into his arms so tightly she gasped. They stood there in the hallway, tangled together, neither able to speak, both afraid that if they did, the moment would shatter. Finally, she pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I don't want a perfect love," she whispered. "I want one that can survive the cracks." He kissed her then, slow and sure, like a man who had almost lost everything and was determined to never make the same mistake again. In the days that followed, they began to rebuild, not by pretending the past hadn't happened, but by facing it head-on. Elena met Victoria, standing her ground with quiet strength and making it clear that she was not a passing distraction, not a phase, not someone to be dismissed. Ethan stood beside her, not as a protector or a shield, but as a partner, someone who had learned that real strength came not from control, but from vulnerability. Together, they found a new rhythm, one that allowed space for both ambition and gentleness, for dreams and doubts, for the messy, imperfect beauty of a love that had been tested and had survived. Elena's art blossomed in ways she had never imagined, her work gaining recognition, not because of who she was with, but because of the honesty and raw emotion that poured from her heart onto every canvas. Ethan, in turn, began to step back from the relentless grind of his empire, rediscovering parts of himself he had long buried beneath success and expectation. They learned to navigate the spotlight together, to face the whispers and the questions with steady eyes and linked hands. And through it all, they chose each other, every day, not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. On a quiet evening, months later, they stood on the balcony of the penthouse, watching the city lights flicker like stars scattered across the earth. Elena leaned into Ethan's side, her head resting on his shoulder, her fingers twined with his. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" she murmured. He smiled faintly, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Every day," he whispered. "And do you regret it?" she asked softly. He turned to her then, his eyes shining with something deep and unshakable. "Never," he said. "You were supposed to be a distraction, a fleeting moment, but you became my truth." Elena closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming, breathtaking gratitude of having found something she never believed she could have. They stood there, wrapped in the quiet, knowing that love was not about perfection or guarantees, but about the simple, powerful choice to stay. And in that moment, as the world spun on beneath them, they both knew that they had found not just love, but home.
A millionaire cruelly abandoned his beloved and their child to be with his mistress. 23 years later, he was paralyzed upon seeing her in a luxury hotel with a young man identical to him. Thomas stood by the window of his lavish penthouse. The shimmering skyline of New York sprawled out before him. He could feel the weight of the decision looming over him, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't about guilt or second thoughts. No, this was about a better life, one filled with luxury, excitement, and the kind of indulgence he felt he deserved. His wife, Helena, had grown distant, bogged down by their remote life on the farm. She wasn't the vibrant woman he had married. And then there was Lucas, their little boy, with his wide eyes and innocent questions. Thomas couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. His gaze flickered toward Olivia, lounging on the expensive leather sofa. She was everything Helena wasn't: glamorous, lively, unpredictable. Olivia didn't want to talk about mundane things like crops or the weather. She wanted to jet off to exotic places, drink champagne on yachts, and attend exclusive parties. She was freedom wrapped in designer silk. "I can't keep pretending," Thomas muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "You don't have to." Olivia's voice was smooth, dripping with confidence. "Helena is holding you back. You've outgrown that life, Thomas. It's time to move on." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Thomas had spent years trying to convince himself that his marriage would get better, that he could rekindle whatever connection he once had with Helena. But the truth was, he had changed, and so had she. The farm life no longer appealed to him, nor did the quiet simplicity of family dinners or the responsibilities of fatherhood. Thomas turned away from the window, grabbing his suitcase from the corner of the room. It was already packed, a silent testament to his decision. No more delays, no more second thoughts. He had booked the flight to Los Angeles for the following morning, where Olivia had connections that could change everything. They would start fresh, away from the farm, from Helena, and from Lucas. As Thomas zipped up the suitcase, a wave of unease washed over him. For a brief moment, he thought of Helena, standing on the porch of their farmhouse, watching as his car drove away. He imagined Lucas running after the car, calling out for his father. His chest tightened, but he quickly buried the feeling. "It's for the best," he told himself. "I can't live that life anymore." Olivia rose from the couch and glided toward him, her manicured hand sliding over his shoulder. "Don't look back, Thomas. You're doing the right thing." He nodded, though the pit in his stomach remained. The truth was, he hadn't even told Helena. There had been no argument, no confrontation. He'd simply stopped answering her calls, stopped visiting the farm. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't stupid. But she had no idea the decision was already made. Thomas knew Helena was too proud to beg him to stay, but deep down, he also knew she would be heartbroken. He could picture her sitting by the old piano in their living room, fingers hovering over the keys, unsure whether to play the melancholy tune that always reflected her mood when things weren't right. It had been years since she performed, and that passion, the one thing that had connected them in the early days, seemed to have disappeared entirely. Now, it was all about survival on that lonely farm. Olivia's grip tightened, pulling him out of his thoughts. "You've got a plane to catch." Without another word, Thomas grabbed the suitcase, the final act that severed him from his past. He wasn't going to be the man tied to a rural life, surrounded by chores and responsibilities. No more chickens to feed, no more crops to tend, no more dull conversations about the weather. He glanced at Olivia one last time before heading to the door. Her smile was bright, full of promise, but it was nothing compared to the warmth Helena used to give him. Still, it was easier this way. Olivia didn't ask for more than he was willing to give, and that was all he needed. Outside, the city lights reflected in his car's windshield as he sped through the streets, leaving behind the quiet life Helena and Lucas still clung to. The farm was hundreds of miles away, but he could already feel the distance growing in his heart. He imagined the moment when Helena would realize he wasn't coming back, her world crumbling without explanation. But that wasn't his problem anymore. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. Helena stood on the porch of the farmhouse, her gaze lost in the distant horizon where the sky met the rolling fields. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape, but she barely noticed. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by the silence that had become all too familiar in recent months. The phone calls from Thomas had stopped weeks ago, and despite her attempts to reach him, there was no answer. She knew something was wrong, but she hadn't been prepared for the truth that would soon hit her. The door creaked as Lucas came out, holding a small toy truck in his hand. "Mama, when is Daddy coming home?" he asked, his wide, innocent eyes looking up at her with hope. Helena's chest tightened. She bent down and brushed his hair back gently. "I don't know, sweetie," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "But we're going to be okay, I promise." She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince more, Lucas or herself. Every day that passed without word from Thomas felt like another step deeper into a reality she didn't want to face. It had been clear for a long time that their marriage wasn't what it used to be. But Helena had held on to the hope that they could find a way back to each other. She had given up so much for him, her career, her dreams of becoming a renowned pianist. She had traded the stage for a life in the country, raising their son and managing the farm while Thomas pursued his business ventures. But now, the silence was deafening. Helena stood up and took a deep breath, forcing herself to look at the world around her. The farm was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. It had always been a place of peace, but lately, it felt like a prison. She could feel the weight of the responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders, the bills, the upkeep, and the constant worry about how she would manage everything on her own. If Thomas wasn't coming back, how would they survive? As she walked inside, Lucas followed closely behind, tugging at her sleeve. "Can we have pancakes for dinner?" Helena smiled faintly. "Sure, pancakes sound perfect," she replied, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her voice. Lucas deserved more than the sadness she was carrying. He was just a child, and she needed to shield him from the truth for as long as she could. The kitchen was small, but cozy, filled with the remnants of the life they had once built together. Helena pulled out the ingredients for pancakes, her mind wandering as she measured flour and cracked eggs. She remembered the early days when she and Thomas had first moved to the farm. They had been full of excitement, eager to start a family and build something meaningful together. The farm had been their dream. Thomas had talked about raising their children in nature, away from the chaos of city life. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Helena shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside. Dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. She needed to focus on the present, on making sure Lucas was fed and happy. That was all that mattered right now. As they sat down to eat, Helena forced herself to engage in light conversation with Lucas, asking about his day and listening to him talk about the toy cars he had been playing with. He was so full of energy and life, unaware of the storm brewing in his mother's heart. Helena envied his innocence, the way he still believed that everything would be okay. But as the night crept in, and Lucas drifted off to sleep, Helena found herself alone with her thoughts once again. She sat by the window, staring out at the fields bathed in moonlight. The farm was quiet, and in that silence, the truth began to settle in her bones. Thomas wasn't coming back. She hadn't received any official word from him, but in her heart, she knew it was over. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time since Thomas's disappearance, she allowed herself to cry. She had been strong for Lucas, holding everything together. But now, in the solitude of the night, she let the weight of it all crush her. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had abandoned them. The life they had built was nothing more than a memory, and she was left to pick up the pieces. After what felt like hours, Helena wiped her eyes and stood up. There was no point in wallowing in sorrow. She had a son to take care of, a farm to run. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. Slowly, she began to steel herself for the reality ahead. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out how to keep the farm going. Tomorrow, she would have to find a way to support Lucas. Tomorrow, she would have to learn how to be both mother and father. It wouldn't be easy, but she had no choice. She had to survive. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the fields as Helena struggled to move a heavy sack of feed toward the barn. Her muscles ached, her body unused to the kind of labor that running a farm demanded. The isolation of it all weighed heavily on her, but she refused to give up. Lucas still slept inside the house, and the last thing she wanted was for him to see her struggling. She wanted him to feel safe, to believe that everything was under control, even when it wasn't. As Helena reached the barn door, she heard the sound of a truck rumbling down the dirt road. It was an unusual sound. Visitors were rare in this part of the countryside. She turned her head, wiping the sweat from her brow, and watched as an old, beat-up pickup truck came to a stop near the house. Out stepped a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with sun-kissed skin and a calm expression. He wore a well-worn hat, boots caked with dirt, and jeans that had seen better days. Helena's guard went up immediately. She wasn't used to strangers coming around, especially not since Thomas had left. The man walked toward her, tipping his hat as he approached. "Morning, ma'am," he said in a deep, steady voice. "Name's Mark. I live a few miles down the road. Heard you could use a hand around here." Helena hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't one to accept charity, and she certainly wasn't comfortable with the idea of letting a stranger into her life. But the truth was, she did need help. The farm was too much for one person, and with Thomas gone, she had no one to turn to. I don't think we need any help," she replied, her voice a little shaky. "But thanks for the offer." Mark didn't budge. He just stood there, his eyes kind but unwavering. "I've seen you working the fields," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's a tough job for anyone, let alone someone trying to do it all alone. I've been a farmer my whole life, and I know how it is." Helena bit her lip, glancing at the sack of feed she had just dropped. She was tired, exhausted, really, and the idea of having help, even for a little while, was tempting. But she wasn't sure she could trust this man. Still, something about his demeanor put her at ease. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a genuine willingness to lend a hand. "I guess I could use some help with the heavier work," she admitted, her pride taking a small hit. Mark nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I'm not here to get in your way, ma'am. Just thought I could make things a little easier for you." Helena let out a sigh and gestured toward the barn. "Well, if you're offering, I could use a hand moving that sack of feed inside." Without another word, Mark rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He moved the heavy bag with ease, his strength evident as he carried it into the barn. Helena watched him, her initial skepticism fading. He wasn't just offering help, he was genuinely capable. She couldn't deny that it was a relief to have someone else take on some of the burden. As the morning went on, Mark continued to assist with the farm work. He repaired a broken fence, helped organize the barn, and even managed to get an old tractor running again. Helena was amazed by how much they had accomplished in just a few hours, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. Over lunch, they sat together at the small wooden table inside the house. Lucas, now awake and full of energy, babbled on about his toy trucks as Helena served them sandwiches. Mark listened patiently, nodding and smiling at Lucas's excitement. Helena couldn't help but notice how natural Mark seemed around her son, how at ease he was in their home. "You've been a big help today," Helena said as they ate, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." Mark shrugged modestly. "Just glad I could help. I've been in your shoes before. Lost my wife a few years back. Things were tough for a while. I know how it feels to try to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Helena looked down at her plate, feeling a pang of empathy for this man she barely knew. She could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't just being polite. He had lived through his own hardships, just like she was now. Maybe that's why he had shown up today. Maybe he understood her struggle better than she realized. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "It's hard, doing all this alone." Mark gave her a small nod, his expression softening. "It doesn't have to be that way, Helena. Sometimes it's okay to let people in. You don't have to do it all on your own." His words struck a chord deep within her. For so long, she had been trying to be strong, trying to hold everything together for Lucas. But maybe Mark was right. Maybe she didn't have to carry this burden alone. As the afternoon stretched on, Helena found herself opening up more to Mark, sharing bits and pieces of her life on the farm, her love for music, and the dreams she once had of being a concert pianist. He listened without interrupting, and by the time he left that evening, Helena felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. Mark's arrival had been unexpected, but maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what she needed. The days following Mark's arrival passed in a blur of work. But for the first time in a long while, Helena didn't feel as though she was drowning. With Mark's help, the farm began to run more smoothly. The fences were mended, the crops tended to, and the weight that had been pressing down on Helena's shoulders seemed to lift, if only just a little. Lucas, too, seemed to have grown fond of Mark. He followed him around like a shadow, asking questions about tractors, animals, and anything else that sparked his young mind. One afternoon, after finishing up with the day's chores, Helena found herself sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm. Mark had gone back to his own farm for the evening, leaving her with some rare quiet time. Inside the house, Lucas was playing with his toy trucks, his happy chatter filling the air. Helena closed her eyes, letting the peacefulness wash over her. And then, almost unconsciously, her mind drifted to the piano, the one she hadn't touched in years. It sat there, in the living room, gathering dust, the same piano that had once been the center of her life, the instrument that had carried her through her teenage years, her college days, and the first years of her marriage. Back then, music had been everything to her. She had spent hours practicing, dreaming of the day she would perform on grand stages in front of large audiences. But those dreams had faded when she married Thomas, and they had vanished completely when they moved to the farm. The piano became more of a relic from a past life, something she didn't dare touch, as if playing it again would remind her of all the things she had lost. But now, with the farm finally running smoothly and Lucas happy, something inside her shifted. The thought of playing again didn't seem so far-fetched. In fact, it felt almost necessary. She stood up, walking back inside the house. Lucas barely noticed as she moved past him toward the corner of the living room where the piano stood. Helena hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the worn, familiar keys. Could she really do this? Could she rediscover that part of herself? She took a deep breath, letting her fingers press down on the keys. The sound that filled the room was soft, almost hesitant at first, but it stirred something deep within her. The melody, one she had memorized years ago, came back slowly, as though her hands remembered even if her mind had forgotten. The notes flowed from the piano, filling the house with music that hadn't been heard in far too long. As she played, memories of her old life, before the farm, before Thomas, before everything, came rushing back. There had been so much hope, so much passion in those days. And even though life had taken a different path, playing the piano again felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Lucas wandered into the living room, his toy truck still in hand, and stood quietly by her side, watching in awe as his mother played. Helena glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to joy. "Wow, Mama," Lucas whispered, his eyes wide. "You're really good." Helena chuckled softly, her fingers never stopping their dance across the keys. "I used to play a lot when I was younger," she explained. "It's been a long time." "Why did you stop?" Lucas asked, his innocent question hanging in the air. Helena's smile faltered for just a moment. She had stopped for so many reasons: Thomas, the move, the responsibilities of raising a family. But how could she explain all of that to her little boy? "I guess life got busy," she said gently. "But maybe it's time I start again." As the days passed, Helena made a point to sit at the piano more often, sometimes playing for hours after Lucas went to bed. The more she played, the more her love for music came rushing back. It wasn't long before Mark noticed the change in her. One evening, after dinner, Helena was at the piano again when Mark knocked on the door. Lucas, thrilled to see him, ran to let him in. Mark stepped inside, his eyes catching sight of Helena at the piano. "I didn't know you played," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Helena stopped, a little self-conscious now that she had an audience. "I used to, a long time ago. I guess I'm just rediscovering it." Mark smiled, that easygoing smile of his. "You're good. Really good." Helena blushed slightly, not used to receiving compliments anymore, especially about something that had once been such a private passion. "Thanks," she muttered, her fingers lingering on the keys. "You ever think about playing for other people, like you used to?" Mark asked, his tone casual but curious. Helena let out a small laugh. "Oh, I don't know about that. I think those days are behind me." "Why? You've got talent, Helena. People should hear you play." The thought of performing again had crossed her mind, but it seemed like such a distant possibility. There were bills to pay, a farm to run, a child to raise. But as she sat there, her fingers tracing the smooth ivory keys, she realized that maybe it wasn't as impossible as she thought. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, not wanting to make any promises, but feeling a glimmer of hope nonetheless. Mark nodded, understanding that it wasn't something she could decide on the spot. But the seed had been planted. Helena felt it, too. A small spark of ambition that had been buried for far too long. As the evening wore on, Mark stayed for a while longer, helping Lucas with his homework and chatting with Helena about farm work. But even after he left, the piano remained at the forefront of her mind. Helena sat at the piano again after Lucas went to bed, this time letting the music flow freely. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for her future. The city lights of New York stretched far and wide, but for Thomas, they no longer sparkled with the same allure. He sat slumped at the corner table of a dimly lit bar, a nearly empty glass of whiskey in front of him. The days of lavish parties, extravagant dinners, and VIP treatment were long gone. It had been months since Olivia had walked out on him, leaving him to face the mounting debts, lawsuits, and failed business ventures that were rapidly consuming everything he had built. Thomas rubbed his temples, trying to block out the reality that had become his life. He had lost it all. The company he had once proudly helmed, the real estate empire that had made him one of New York's most admired businessmen, was gone. He had made bad deals, risky investments that didn't pay off, and Olivia, ever the opportunist, had left the moment the money stopped flowing. She hadn't even bothered with a proper goodbye, just packed her bags and vanished. The truth was, he had seen it coming. There had been signs: her growing disinterest, the late-night phone calls, the subtle hints that she was looking for something else, someone else. But Thomas had chosen to ignore them, just like he had ignored Helena's calls when he left her behind on the farm. The bartender, a middle-aged man who had seen one too many customers drown their sorrows at his counter, came over and eyed Thomas with mild sympathy. "You need a refill?" he asked. Thomas shook his head, pushing the glass away. "No, I'm good," he mumbled, though nothing about his situation felt good. He stood up from the bar and tossed a few crumpled bills on the counter, enough to cover his tab. As he made his way to the exit, the cold night air hit him like a slap. The city was loud and vibrant, as it always was, but to Thomas it felt distant, like he no longer belonged there. He had never imagined his life would come to this. A year ago, he had been on top of the world, rich, admired, and with a beautiful woman on his arm. But all of it had been built on lies, deception, and the shallow pursuit of wealth. The empire he had once been so proud of had collapsed in a matter of months. His bank accounts were frozen, his properties seized, and his name dragged through the mud in the press. The final blow had come just a few weeks ago, when he had been forced to sell the last of his assets. The only thing left was his apartment, and even that was barely hanging on by a thread. The creditors were closing in, and soon he would be left with nothing but his reputation, one that had been shattered beyond repair. As Thomas walked through the crowded streets, his mind wandered back to the farm, back to Helena and Lucas. He hadn't thought about them in so long, but now, in the middle of his downfall, they seemed to haunt his every waking moment. What had they done to deserve his abandonment? Helena had been nothing but supportive, even when he had decided to chase after Olivia and leave them both behind. And Lucas. Thomas couldn't even remember the last time he had seen his son. The boy had probably grown so much by now, but Thomas had missed it all. He had missed birthdays, milestones, everything. All for what? For a life of luxury that had proven to be nothing more than an illusion. His feet carried him aimlessly until he found himself standing outside a gleaming hotel. It was one of the high-end places he used to frequent, back when money was no object and everything seemed possible. But now, the sight of it only filled him with shame. He had applied for a job there just the other day, not as a guest, but as a janitor. Thomas glanced through the glass doors of the hotel, catching a glimpse of the polished marble floors and sparkling chandeliers inside. He had walked those very floors in designer suits, brushing shoulders with the elite, confident and powerful. Now, he was nothing more than a shadow of the man he used to be. The interview had been humiliating. Sitting in a tiny office, dressed in clothes that no longer fit quite right. He had filled out the application, barely able to meet the eyes of the young hotel manager who interviewed him. The manager had looked him over, clearly skeptical that a man like Thomas would be willing to mop floors and scrub toilets for a living. But Thomas didn't have a choice. He needed the money. There was nowhere else to turn. The job had been offered to him on the spot. The pay was minimal, but it was something. It was enough to keep him afloat, at least for now. Tomorrow would be his first shift. Tomorrow, he would step into a life he had never imagined for himself. Thomas took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. This was the consequence of his choices, the women he had pursued, the deals he had made, the family he had abandoned. It was all catching up to him now, and there was no escaping it. The following morning, Thomas arrived at the hotel for his first day of work. The uniform they gave him felt foreign on his skin, a far cry from the tailored suits he once wore. He kept his head down, avoiding the eyes of the hotel staff as he grabbed the cleaning supplies and set off to start his shift. As he scrubbed the floors, the reality of his situation hit him like a tidal wave. This was his life now. No more parties, no more lavish dinners. Just him, a mop, and the echoes of his past mistakes. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. Something that could teach him the lessons he had so desperately needed to learn. Helena sat at her piano, her fingers flowing effortlessly across the keys as the music filled the room. The soft light of the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the small concert hall where she was rehearsing. It had been years since she had felt this alive, this connected to her true self. The melodies she played seemed to carry her beyond the weight of her responsibilities, lifting her above the hardships she had faced. She had come so far since those dark days on the farm when the weight of Thomas's abandonment had crushed her spirit. Now, instead of struggling to survive, she was thriving. Her name was known, her music celebrated in local circles, and invitations to play at events and small concerts had started to pour in. The community had embraced her talent, and with each performance, Helena found herself rediscovering the passion that had once defined her. Her success had been gradual, but steady, thanks in no small part to Mark. He had encouraged her every step of the way, always reminding her of the gift she had buried for so long. He had taken on more of the farm work, giving Helena the freedom to focus on her music again. And Lucas, who was now in school, was thriving as well. Their life had become one of balance and joy, a far cry from the lonely struggle Helena had faced alone. After her rehearsal, Helena stepped off the stage, taking a moment to absorb the feeling of accomplishment. She had a performance that evening, and she could already feel the anticipation building. It wasn't the grand stage she had once dreamed of, but it was a start, and the most important thing was that she was doing what she loved, for herself, for Lucas, and for Mark. Mark had been more than a support. In the years since he had entered her life, he had become her partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had built something beautiful, a family, a home, and now a future. It wasn't the life she had originally envisioned for herself, but in many ways, it was better. There was love, stability, and a shared purpose that filled every day with meaning. As Helena gathered her things to head home, she caught sight of Lucas in the hallway, holding Mark's hand as they approached. Her heart swelled at the sight of them, a reminder of the life they had built together. Lucas had grown so much, and he adored Mark, looking up to him as a father figure. It was a bond that filled Helena with gratitude every day. "Mama!" Lucas ran toward her, his face lighting up with excitement. "Are you ready for tonight? I told all my friends at school about your concert." Helena laughed, bending down to give him a hug. "I'm ready, sweetheart, and I'm glad you're so excited." Mark smiled, his eyes warm as he watched the exchange. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," he said, stepping closer to wrap his arm around Helena's shoulders. "You're going to be amazing." Helena leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his presence. "Thanks to you," she said softly. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Mark shook his head, his smile widening. "You've always had this in you, Helena. I just gave you a little push." It was true. Mark had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. He had been there, day after day, helping her rediscover the part of her that had been buried for so long. And now, as she prepared for yet another performance, Helena felt more alive than she had in years. Later that evening, as the concert hall filled with the quiet murmur of the audience, Helena stood backstage, nerves fluttering in her stomach. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was her moment. She had worked hard to get here, and no matter what happened, she had already won. She had reclaimed her music, her passion, and her life. The lights dimmed, and the announcer's voice echoed through the hall, introducing her to the waiting crowd. Helena stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. But as soon as her fingers touched the keys, all the nervousness melted away. The music took over, flowing from her fingertips with a grace and ease that felt like coming home. The audience was silent, captivated by the beauty of her performance. Helena's eyes remained closed as she played, losing herself in the music. This was where she belonged, and she knew it now more than ever. The years of hardship, the sacrifices she had made, all of it had led her to this moment. And as she played the final notes, a wave of emotion washed over her. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Helena stood and bowed, her heart swelling with gratitude. In the front row, she spotted Mark and Lucas, their faces beaming with pride. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. After the concert, as the audience filtered out and the stagehands began to clear the space, Helena found herself surrounded by well-wishers. People congratulated her, praising her talent and the beauty of her performance. It was a humbling experience, one that made her realize just how far she had come. But amid the celebration, it was Mark and Lucas who stood out the most. They were her family, the ones who had been there through it all. Mark wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You were incredible," he whispered, his voice filled with admiration. Helena smiled, resting her head against his chest. "I couldn't have done it without you." Later that night, as they drove back to the farm, Helena looked out at the darkened fields, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had built a new life, one that was filled with love, music, and the promise of a future she had once thought impossible. And as they pulled into the driveway, Helena realized that for the first time in a long time, she was truly happy. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow as he pushed the mop across the hotel lobby floor, the once polished marble now a sea of dirty footprints left by guests bustling in and out. He hated this job. Every swipe of the mop reminded him of the life he'd lost, the wealth, the power, the sense of importance. Now, he was just another face in the crowd, forgotten and overlooked. The hotel's grandeur mocked him. The chandeliers above sparkled like the life he once lived, so close yet utterly out of reach. Each day was a grim reminder of the choices that had led him here. He had traded his family for Olivia, for what he thought was a better life, and it had all crumbled. He hadn't seen or heard from Helena in years, and he tried not to think about Lucas, the son he had abandoned. Guilt gnawed at him, but there was no going back now. All he could do was keep his head down and get through the day. The lobby was busy with guests checking in, couples heading to dinner, and families preparing for a night out in the city. Thomas kept to himself, avoiding eye contact, blending into the background like the furniture. His life had become a routine of mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, and taking out trash. It was humiliating, but it was all he had. As he rounded the corner, pushing his cleaning cart along with him, he glanced up and froze in place. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Standing at the far end of the lobby, looking radiant and poised, was Helena. Time seemed to slow down as Thomas stared, unable to process what he was seeing. She was older, of course, but the years had been kind to her. She stood there, gracefully holding the hand of a man who was clearly not Thomas. Next to them was a young boy, not much younger than Lucas had been the last time Thomas had seen him. And then, as his eyes shifted, they landed on a young man, tall, with sharp features and an air of confidence. His heart clenched painfully as he realized it was Lucas. They were all together, Helena, Lucas, and the man Thomas didn't know, the man who must have replaced him. The mop slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning, torn between disbelief and an overwhelming sense of regret. He had never imagined he would see them again, especially not like this. Happy, successful, without him. Helena didn't notice him at first. She was busy checking in at the front desk, laughing softly with Lucas and the man by her side. But then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Her eyes met his. And for a split second, neither of them moved. The recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by a mix of surprise and something else. Pity, maybe. Thomas's throat went dry. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came out. The years of silence, of running away from his mistakes, had caught up with him in this single moment, and all he could feel was the crushing weight of his failures. Helena's gaze lingered on him for just a moment longer before she looked away, turning back to Lucas and the man. She didn't rush to confront him, didn't make a scene. Instead, she carried on with her conversation, as if he were nothing more than a stranger passing by. But to Thomas, it felt like a punch to the gut. He stood there, rooted in place, watching as Helena and her new family moved toward the elevators. Lucas glanced back briefly, his eyes brushing over Thomas without a hint of recognition. It was as if he didn't even remember his own father. And why would he? Thomas had been gone for so long, leaving nothing but an empty space in Lucas's life. The elevator doors slid shut, and just like that, they were gone. Thomas stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Helena looked happy. Happier than he had ever seen her when they were together. The man by her side, with his arm around her, clearly loved her. They had a family now, one that didn't include him. The pain hit him harder than he expected. He had always known that Helena would move on, that she would find someone better than him. But seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. He had never felt more alone, more worthless, Then in that moment, his thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice. "Hey, are you going to finish cleaning or just stand there?" Thomas blinked and turned to see the hotel manager staring at him with an annoyed expression. Without another word, he picked up the mop and continued working, though his hands trembled and his mind was far away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Thomas went through the motions, cleaning, scrubbing, doing what was expected of him. But his mind was elsewhere. Back with Helena, back with Lucas, back to the life he had thrown away. He had no idea what to do next, no idea if he should even try to reach out to her. What could he possibly say after all these years, after all the pain he had caused? As he clocked out and walked back to his small, dingy apartment that night, the image of Helena and her new family haunted him. He had missed so much. Lucas growing up, the life they had built without him. And now, seeing them happy, successful, and complete without him only magnified the emptiness he felt inside. Thomas knew, deep down, that there was no going back. The life he had destroyed could never be rebuilt, but for the first time, he wondered if there was still a chance, however small, for redemption. Maybe, just maybe, he could make things right, even if he could never truly be part of their lives again. Thomas barely slept that night, his mind consumed by the image of Helena and Lucas. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. For years, he had pushed thoughts of his old life away, burying them under the weight of his ambition and greed. But now, after seeing them so unexpectedly, it was all he could think about. By the time the sun began to rise, Thomas had made up his mind. He had to speak to Helena. He couldn't go on like this, living with the regret, the guilt, the what-ifs. He knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness, but he had to try. He had to face the consequences of his choices, no matter how painful. The next day, Thomas returned to the hotel, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't worked up the courage to ask around about Helena's room number, so he waited in the lobby, pacing nervously near the elevators. Each time the doors opened, he held his breath, hoping it would be her. Hours passed, and doubt began to creep in. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she had already left, taking her new life with her and leaving him behind once again? The thought made his stomach churn, but he refused to leave. He couldn't walk away, not this time. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, the elevator doors opened, and there she was. Helena stepped out, looking radiant as ever, though the weight of their shared history hung between them like a thick fog. She paused when she saw him standing there, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension thick in the air. "Helena," Thomas finally said, his voice shaky and low. "Can we talk?" She didn't respond right away, her eyes studying him with a mixture of surprise and caution. Thomas could see the wariness in her gaze, the hesitation, the memories of all he had done to her. "Please," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need to talk to you." Helena let out a slow breath, her expression softening slightly. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's talk." They stepped outside the hotel, the cool autumn air brushing against their skin. They found a small bench in a nearby park, away from the bustle of the city. Thomas sat down first, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. Helena sat beside him, but there was a distance between them that felt like a chasm. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Thomas struggled to find the words, unsure of where to even begin. How could he explain himself? How could he possibly make up for everything he had done? I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Helena, I'm so sorry for everything, for leaving you, for abandoning Lucas. His words caught in his throat, and he swallowed hard. "I was selfish. I was a coward." Helena didn't respond right away. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, listening as Thomas poured his heart out. "I thought I wanted something more," he continued, his voice trembling. "I thought the money, the luxury, all of it would make me happy. But it didn't. It ruined everything. I lost everything. And now I see you, and you've built this incredible life without me. I don't blame you for moving on, for finding happiness. But I can't stop thinking about what I threw away." Helena finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Thomas, it wasn't just about the money. You left because you wanted a different life, and that's fine. But you didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from Lucas, too." Thomas winced at the mention of his son. It was the deepest wound, the one that hurt the most. He had abandoned Lucas, left him without a father, all because of his own greed. "I know," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve his forgiveness, or yours. But I'm asking you anyway. Not to forget what I did, but to at least forgive me." Helena's gaze softened, her eyes reflecting a sadness that mirrored his own. "Thomas, I've spent years trying to make peace with what happened. I've rebuilt my life. Lucas has grown into a wonderful young man, and Mark has been there for both of us." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "I can see that. I saw you all together, and it's clear how happy you are. You deserve that, Helena. You deserve all the happiness in the world." Helena looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. "I do forgive you, Thomas," she said softly. "Not for you, but for me. Holding on to that pain, that anger, it wasn't helping anyone. And I'm in a different place now. I have a new life, but that doesn't mean the hurt just goes away." Her words were like a balm to his wounded soul, though they carried a bittersweet edge. She had moved on, truly moved on, and there was no place for him in her life anymore. He had known that deep down, but hearing it from her made it real. "I don't expect anything from you," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry, and I wanted to hear you say that you're okay, that you're happy." Helena nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I am happy, Thomas. And I hope you can find some peace, too." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history settling between them. It was a strange kind of closure, one filled with both forgiveness and finality. Thomas knew that Helena's life would continue without him, just as it had for all these years. And though it hurt, he accepted it. "I should go," Helena said after a while, standing up. "Take care of yourself, Thomas." Thomas watched as she turned to leave, her figure growing smaller as she walked back toward the hotel. He sat there for a long time after she was gone, the cool air nipping at his skin. He had come seeking forgiveness, and he had found it, but the emptiness inside him remained. As he stood up and began to walk away, Thomas realized that he still had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Helena walked away from Thomas, her heart a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The encounter had dredged up feelings she had long buried, but now, as she moved farther from him, she realized how much she had healed. The man she had once loved, the man she had built her life with, was now just a shadow from the past. He was no longer the center of her world, and for that, she was grateful. The city streets were bustling as Helena made her way back to the hotel. Mark and Lucas were probably wondering where she had gone, but she needed those few moments alone to process everything. Thomas's plea for forgiveness had been heartfelt, but it wasn't the words that struck her. It was the look in his eyes. The guilt, the regret, the weight of his mistakes. Helena knew those feelings well. She had carried them for years, thinking she had done something wrong, that she wasn't enough to keep him. But now she understood that Thomas's decisions had nothing to do with her. They had been his alone, and she had finally let go of the need to carry the burden of his choices. As she approached the hotel lobby, she spotted Lucas sitting with Mark by one of the large windows. They were laughing about something, their bond so natural, so real. It warmed her heart to see Lucas so happy, thriving in this life they had created together. Mark had stepped in, not to replace Thomas, but to fill the void that Thomas had left behind. He had been there for Lucas in ways that Helena could never fully express in words, and for that, she was endlessly grateful. When Lucas saw her, he jumped up, running toward her with that infectious energy only a young man like him could have. "Mama, where did you go? We were waiting for you." Helena smiled, wrapping her arms around him in a hug. "I just needed some fresh air, sweetheart," she said, glancing over at Mark, who was watching her with a knowing look. She could tell he sensed something was different, but he didn't ask. Mark always knew when to give her space. "You ready to head out?" Mark asked, standing up and stretching. "The concert hall's not far, but we don't want to be late." Helena nodded, smoothing a hand over Lucas's hair. "Yeah, let's go." As they walked through the city streets toward the concert hall, Helena felt lighter than she had in years. The conversation with Thomas had given her a kind of closure she hadn't known she needed. Forgiving him hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, not just for him, but for her own peace. Holding on to that anger, that pain, had weighed her down for far too long. Mark walked beside her, his hand brushing against hers. She slipped her fingers into his, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough. He had always been enough. From the moment he had come into her life, he had been the steady force she didn't realize she needed. Lucas walked ahead of them, his excitement about the evening bubbling over in every step. "Mama, I can't wait to see you perform tonight. Do you think there will be a lot of people there?" Helena smiled at his enthusiasm. "I think so, sweetheart. It's going to be a great night." The concert hall loomed ahead of them, its lights bright against the evening sky. As they stepped inside, Helena felt the familiar rush of nerves that always came before a performance. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was excitement. She was doing what she loved, and she had her family by her side. That was all that mattered. Backstage, as Helena prepared for the performance, she found a moment to herself, gazing into the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked calm, confident, and sure of herself. It was a far cry from the person she had been all those years ago when Thomas had walked out of her life. She had been broken then, unsure of her future, unsure of how she would survive. But now, she had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, and found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. It was one of the stagehands, letting her know it was almost time. Helena took a deep breath, smoothing her dress before walking toward the stage. As she stepped out into the bright lights, the applause from the audience filled the hall, a hum of energy that settled her nerves. She took her seat at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys, and for a brief moment she thought of Thomas. Not with anger or regret, but with compassion. He had been a part of her journey, a chapter in her life that had shaped who she was, but he was no longer the center of her story. This was her moment now, her future, her happiness. The first notes of her performance filled the air, and Helena lost herself in the music. It was as if the world outside the concert hall had faded away, leaving only the piano, the audience, and her. Every chord, every melody, flowed from her heart, carrying with it the emotions of the past and the hope of the future. As the final note echoed through the hall, the audience erupted in applause. Helena stood and bowed, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She glanced toward the front row, where Mark and Lucas were standing, clapping louder than anyone else. Her family, her home. After the concert, as people filtered out and congratulated her, Helena found herself smiling, not just because of the success of the performance, but because of the peace she had found within herself. She had forgiven Thomas, and in doing so, She had freed herself from the weight of the past. Later, as they walked back to their hotel, Lucas chattered excitedly about the concert, and Mark slipped his arm around Helena's waist. The night air was cool, but Helena felt warm, wrapped in the love of the people who mattered most to her. As they reached their room, Helena paused, taking in the quiet peace of the moment. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at Mark. "For what?" he asked, smiling. "For everything," she replied, leaning into him. "For helping me find my way back to myself." Mark kissed her forehead gently. "You did that all on your own, Helena. I was just lucky enough to be along for the ride." Helena smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. She had come so far, and the road ahead was still full of possibilities. But now, with her family by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. The echo of Helena's voice stayed with Thomas long after their conversation ended. He had spent the night wandering the streets of New York, unsure of where to go or what to do. The forgiveness he had sought from Helena was bittersweet. It offered him relief. But at the same time, it underscored the reality of how much he had truly lost. He had been forgiven, yes, but he hadn't been welcomed back. There would be no reunion with the family he had abandoned. There was no way to undo the years of absence, no way to be a part of their lives again. The closure Helena had given him was real, but it also served as a final reminder that his past was behind him, locked away, and he had no place in her future. By the time Thomas reached his small apartment, the sun was already creeping over the skyline. The apartment was a far cry from the luxurious spaces he used to inhabit. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare, and the silence was deafening. This was all he had now, the result of his ambition and greed. Once upon a time, he had everything: a family, a fortune, and a future full of possibilities. Now he had nothing but memories and regrets. As he stood by the small window, looking out over the city that had once felt like his playground, Thomas couldn't help but think about all the choices that had led him here. He had always believed that success was measured by wealth, by how many people admired you, by how much you could control. He had chased power, indulged in luxuries, and believed that the more he had, the happier he would be. But that illusion had shattered long ago. Thomas turned away from the window, sinking into the worn-out chair in the corner of the room. He had spent years running from his mistakes, pretending that they didn't matter, that he could outrun the consequences of abandoning his family. But now, sitting alone in this empty apartment, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. Helena had moved on, built a new life, and found happiness with Mark and their children. Thomas had seen it in her eyes, in the way she had spoken to him with calm and certainty. She wasn't angry anymore. She had let go. But she had also made it clear that her new life didn't have room for him and Lucas. The thought of his son twisted a knife in Thomas's heart. He had barely recognized the young man who had stood beside Helena in the hotel lobby. Lucas had grown so much, and Thomas hadn't been there to witness any of it. He hadn't seen his son grow up, hadn't been there for birthdays, for milestones, for anything. The boy who had once idolized him now didn't even know him. Thomas had become a stranger in his own son's life. The guilt was crushing. Thomas had tried to ignore it for years, pushing it down, telling himself that he had made the right choice by pursuing a different life. But seeing Lucas again had shattered that delusion. He had abandoned his own child, and no amount of success or money could ever make up for that. But what hurt the most wasn't the realization of what he had lost. It was the understanding that he could never get it back. There was no second chance with Lucas. Even if he reached out, even if he tried to make amends, it would never be the same. He had missed too much, and Lucas had grown up without him. Thomas leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. How had he let it get this far? How had he become so blind to what really mattered? He had thought he was chasing happiness, but all along, he had been running from it. For the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself to truly reflect on the man he had become. He had spent so long believing that power and wealth were the only things that mattered. But in the end, they had left him empty and alone. The success he had craved had come at the cost of the people he loved most. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. None of it had been worth it. Not the money, not the parties, not the prestige. He had traded everything that really mattered for a hollow life of luxury that had crumbled the moment things got tough. Thomas stood up, pacing the small room. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here drowning in regret. But what could he do? Helena had made it clear that their lives had diverged, and Lucas probably didn't even remember him. Still, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. He had to try. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could try to make peace with it. The next day, Thomas found himself standing outside a small cafe near Central Park, where Helena had once mentioned she liked to bring Lucas when they visited the city. It was a long shot, but he had no other plan. He didn't expect a warm reception. In fact, he wasn't even sure if Lucas would want to see him, but he had to try. As the hours passed, Thomas sat at one of the outdoor tables, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He watched the people pass by, families, couples, children laughing and playing in the park. Each face was a reminder of the life he had given up, the family he had lost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw them. Helena, Mark, Lucas, and their younger child were walking toward the park, smiling and laughing together. Thomas's heart clenched at the sight. They looked so happy, so complete. He knew he didn't belong there, but something inside him urged him to stand up, to try. Helena spotted him first. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, but then she gave him a small nod. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was permission to be there, even if he was no longer part of their lives. Lucas glanced over, his expression unreadable. Thomas's heart ached as he watched his son, now nearly a man, walk past without a word. But this time, it didn't crush him. This time, he understood. Lucas didn't owe him anything. He had built a life without his father, and Thomas had to accept that. But as Helena and her family continued walking, something shifted inside Thomas. He couldn't undo the past, but he could start by accepting the consequences. He had asked for forgiveness, and now he had to forgive himself, not for leaving, but for the years he had wasted running from the truth. Thomas stayed at the cafe until long after they were gone, the weight of his reflections settling over him like a quiet rain. He wasn't the man he used to be, and perhaps that was the most important step he could take, understanding that he had to change, and that redemption didn't come with a grand gesture, but with small steps. As he stood up and walked toward the park, the city alive with the sounds of life around him, Thomas felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Hope. As the weeks passed, Thomas found himself reflecting more and more on his encounter with Helena and Lucas. The pain of seeing them happy without him still lingered, but it had also sparked something inside him, a desire to change, to rebuild his life from the ashes of his mistakes. He knew that redemption wouldn't come easily, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face the future rather than hide from it. He threw himself into his work at the hotel, no longer seeing it as a punishment, but as a chance to prove to himself that he could be more than the man who had lost everything. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and Thomas began to find a certain peace in the routine. Every day, he worked quietly and diligently, and though the other employees barely noticed him, he took pride in doing the job well. It wasn't just about earning a paycheck anymore. It was about rebuilding his sense of self-worth. For too long, Thomas had measured his value by his wealth and status. But now, he was learning that true worth came from within. He had spent so many years chasing after external validation, but now he was beginning to understand that the person he needed to prove something to was himself. One day, as Thomas finished his shift and headed out of the hotel, he felt a strange sense of calm. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer crushed him. He had made peace with the fact that he couldn't go back, and now he was focused on moving forward, no matter how slowly. Walking through the streets of New York, he found himself wandering towards Central Park, a place that had become a sort of refuge for him in recent weeks. The park was alive with activity. Families picnicking, children playing, people jogging along the paths. It was a reminder of the life that continued all around him, even as he rebuilt his own. As he reached a quiet bench near the edge of the park, Thomas sat down and gazed out at the people passing by. His thoughts drifted to Helena, to Lucas, and to the life he had lost. But instead of bitterness or regret, he felt a sense of acceptance. They had moved on, and so had he. Helena had forgiven him, and now it was time to forgive himself. Lost in thought, he barely noticed when someone approached the bench. It wasn't until the familiar sound of footsteps stopped in front of him that Thomas looked up, his breath catching in his throat. It was Lucas. The young man stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression cautious but not unkind. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, he had no idea what to say. "Hi, Dad," Lucas said, his voice steady but hesitant. Thomas swallowed hard, the word "dad" hitting him with a force he hadn't expected. He hadn't heard Lucas call him that in so many years, and hearing it now after everything that had happened felt like both a gift and a reminder of all the time they had lost. "Hi, Lucas," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse. Lucas glanced down at the ground for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Then, he looked up, meeting his father's gaze. "I saw you at the cafe the other day. I didn't know if I should say anything, but I guess I just wanted to see if you were okay." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. Of all the things he had expected, this wasn't one of them. He had assumed that Lucas wouldn't want anything to do with him, that the distance between them was too great to bridge. But here he was, standing in front of him, offering something Thomas had never dared hope for. A chance. I'm trying to be," Thomas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I wasn't there for you, Lucas, and I can never make up for that, but I want you to know that I'm sorry, for everything." Lucas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I spent a long time being angry at you," he said, his tone measured. "You left, and for a while I didn't understand why. I guess I still don't, not completely." Thomas opened his mouth to explain, but Lucas raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not asking you to explain it," he continued. "I've already made peace with it. I don't want to carry that anger anymore. I've seen how happy Mom is now, with Mark, with the life we've built. And I guess I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't helping anyone, least of all me." Thomas felt a surge of emotion welling up inside him. He wanted to reach out, to tell Lucas how much he regretted every moment he had missed, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. All he could do was listen and hope that in some small way, they could find a way forward. "I don't expect anything from you," Lucas added, his voice softening. "But I wanted you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I've moved on, and I hope you can too." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Lucas. That means more to me than you'll ever know." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Thomas wanted to say so much more, to ask Lucas about his life, to find some way to reconnect, but he knew that this was a delicate moment, and he didn't want to push too hard. After what felt like an eternity, Lucas finally spoke again. "I'm meeting up with Mom and Mark soon," he said, glancing toward the park. "But maybe we can talk sometime. You know, catch up." Thomas's heart soared at the offer. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start to rebuild the relationship he had lost with his son. "I'd like that," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd really like that." Lucas gave him a small smile, a gesture that felt like a lifeline in the midst of the storm that had been Thomas's life. Then, with a nod, he turned and walked toward the park, leaving Thomas standing there, watching him go. As Lucas disappeared into the crowd, Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had been given a second chance, not just with Lucas, but with himself. It wasn't much, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was enough. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like he could breathe again. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. Step by step, moment by moment, he would rebuild his life, no longer defined by the mistakes of his past, but by the hope of what could still be. As he walked away from the park, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Thomas smiled. It wasn't over. Not yet.